I think the most successful investors I speak with regularly are typically ones who have a fair bit of discipline. They have a very good long-term goal, but they have an element of creativity, and they are not rigid to the point where they can't move their mindset or change their strategy if the unforeseen or unexpected happens. And I think that's where the best elements of the best investors come in, is they have a relatively flexible mindset if need be, and they don't have a woe is me mentality when things go wrong. They say, well, I've got to figure out how to do something different here.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how on where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You'll hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested. Hi, freedom fighters. Are you disciplined and flexible? Now, at first, this sounds like a bit of a contradiction in terms or an oxymoron, but in actual fact, they make up two different yet complementary and very essential qualities for success, as will be revealed in today's really awesome episode. So what do we mean by this? Well, discipline's about controlling your own actions. It's about staying the course. It's about doing things regularly, come rain, hail or snow. No excuses. It's about being repetitious, about developing what I often call happy habits that don't reap any immediate, obvious or visible rewards, but over the fullness of time, create massive changes, impacts and results. As Jocko Willink, the ex-commander of the US Navy SEALs, once famously said, discipline equals freedom. And I love this quote from his book of the same name. It goes like this: no more. No more, no more, no more excuses, no more I'll start tomorrow, no more just this once, no more accepting the shortfalls of my own will, no more taking the easy road, no more bowing down to whatever unhealthy or unproductive thoughts float through my mind. No more. No more waiting for the perfect moment, and no more indecision, and no more lies. No more weakness. No more. Now is the time for strength. And through strength, and through will, and through unwavering discipline, I will become what I want to be. I will become who I want to be. And then, and only then, will I rest and say, no more. It's a really telling quote. Flexibility, on the other hand, is about being able to bend without breaking. It's about being adaptable and being prepared to adjust and to change your course and your settings to reflect changing dynamics. It's about keeping your eye on the end destination while navigating and adjusting to variable conditions to ensure that you actually get there. And when you combine discipline with flexibility, it's a bit like becoming a really good surfer. And you'll understand the relevance of this analogy once we talk about today's special guest. You need to have the discipline to be out there in the water every day, regardless of the weather, but then being flexible enough to constantly move and adjust your position in the water so you're always in the best position at the best time to catch the best waves and then enjoy the best rides. And to expand on these qualities, as well as everything else that it takes to be a successful property investor, you're really going to enjoy today's guest, Paul Glossop. Paul really walks his talk. In many respects, Paul's very much like my long-lost, much younger brother. We've both had similar interests like being fitness and architecture tragics, and we've both followed similar paths that have helped us to both enjoy a great lifestyle from our property investments, and led us both to help others to do the same through our books and our businesses. The only difference being that Paul focuses on helping you as a buyer's agent, while we focus on the finance structure and property strategy. But it hasn't always been that way for Paul. A bit more than a decade or so ago, he was broke, out of a job, and in debt. Now, he's basically retired in his mid-30s, and since that time, has acquired 17 properties worth almost $9 million. And like me, he also believes that you and anyone else can do the same if you apply the same mindset. You see, Paul took a calculated risk when he walked away from a very successful corporate career to start something that he was really passionate about, helping others change their lives through investing in property. And the good news for you is that Paul's approach is actually quite simple and straightforward. Like me, he believes the mark of financial success isn't about getting bigger, better, faster, or more. To him, success is freedom. Freedom to spend more time with his family, giving to others, and of course, more time to go surfing. And as an avid surfer, Paul knows that property investing is like catching the perfect wave break. It's what led to the title of his highly acclaimed and best-selling book, A Surfer's Guide to Property Investing: How to Achieve Financial Goals and Lead Your Best Life Through Investing in Property. Now Paul's the managing director of his own buyer's agency, Pure Property Investment, and he's a board member of PIPA, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia. Over the last 10 years, Paul has been involved in more than 500 property transactions for his clients, and he's seen the right and the wrong way to surf the property wave. So, during our great chat that is absolutely jam-packed with investment gold, you're going to learn what mindset you need to be successful, the 3 critical keys to being successful in property investment in order to achieve your lifestyle goals, the advantages of building and developing property, the massive benefits of rent vesting, and why you should have a property-focused accountant and a professional buyer's agent on your team, and how to pick a good one. Now, like our view of long-term successful investing, if you hang in there till the end of this episode to reap the rewards, Paul's made a very generous offer for a limited number of listeners. And I'm going to double down on his offer by also gifting you a copy of my second book, Get Invested, if you email me the words A Surfer's Guide to Property Investing in the subject heading, along with the exact number of copies that Paul mentions at the end of this show. So just email those to me personally at bushy@khgroup.com.au. That's bushy, B-U-S-H-Y, at khgroup.com.au with your name, your number, and your contact details. So, for anyone interested in how to successfully invest in property to secure your ideal lifestyle, you can't miss this awesome conversation with Paul Glossop. Welcome back, Freedom Fighters. And today, I feel like I'm going to be having a discussion with a younger brother from another mother. Quite amazingly, in the homework I've been doing around our guest today, we followed quite similar and parallel paths, but probably 10 or 20 years difference in the time frame. So I'm really excited about having a really deep dive chat around all things property investment today. So welcome, and let's get invested, Paul Glossop.
Thanks for having me, Bushy.
Awesome, mate. Now, mate, for those who don't know you and what you do, can you give us a quick rundown?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am, my name's Paul Glossop, obviously, as per your kind introduction. But look, I think quite funnily, when we've had a bit of a chat about your background and everything that you've done in your life to date is, as you said, it's probably circa, if I didn't, if we didn't know each other, or if we did know each other, it'd be a little bit scary because it probably feels like I've maybe followed a fair few of the things that sounds like you've done in your life over the last decades as well, mate. But look, I'm a licensed registered buyer's agent by trade and the owner and director of a company called Pure Property Investment. What we effectively do and what I do from my day-to-day basis now is effectively help time poor individuals set strategies, source and secure assets, and manage to build their long-term wealth through strategic property investing. And really, mate, that's been I guess something that's flowed in as far as my current vocation has been something that's probably been 15 years worth of previous life of investing, as well as absolutely separate jobs and life choices that came from university studying architecture, similar to yourself, and going into different aspects of corporate life, which allowed me to get the income to allow me to invest in property over a long period of time, and taking quite a diverse journey and probably attacking property from multiple different angles. And that's really a similar mindset and strategy that we have with our clients, where we don't necessarily follow inverted commas, a strategic mold that is a cookie cutter approach. We most certainly focus on every single client having different needs, objectives, and starting positions. And we source property from as low as 200 grand right through to as high as 2 or 3 mil.
Yeah, brilliant. Awesome, mate. Let's talk about the magic why. Why are you now helping others in the buyer's agent and property investment strategy space?
Mate, if I was to crystallise it into one why, and I could give plenty of them, but ultimately for me, it came down for me to be a real selfish choice. And that selfish choice for me was, I built a property portfolio over a relatively decent period of time, which gave me exactly that, which was time. I started my property investment journey with my wife when we didn't have kids, when we were just boyfriend and girlfriend back then. And that led into obviously life becoming more complex and having busy full-time jobs and then starting a family and all those things that came with it. But eventually we ended up creating a financial position through property, which gave us the choice of, do we want to chase the big income and everything that comes into that forever? And is that going to happen for another 25, 30 years? Or are we content with how we live our lives, and do we have time? And because we found via going through that exercise and all that hard graft of 10, 15 years of investing, developing, etc., the time piece really was why I loved what I do and why I chose to do what I did. Is I didn't need the big corporate salary any further. I didn't necessarily aspire to get a 50-foot yacht as my next purchase, where, and not to say that that's what I want people to not aspire to, because I think that's everyone's choice. But for me, what I do is try to create plans to allow people to get as much time back in their life as possible through strategic investing.
Yeah, I love it. And I mean, that's another common element of our beliefs and drivers, I think, Paul, is that for me, it's always been about time and having the time to do what I want, when I want, with who I want, and where I want. The peace of mind that goes with that, you just can't put a value against. And totally agree with you around how much is enough. And I'm going to delve into that in a little bit more detail as we move through, because it's not chasing money for the sake of chasing money. It's getting clear around how do you want to live, and therefore how am I going to find that lifestyle without necessarily me working 40 to 50 hours a week to make that happen. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant, mate. So I'd love to now sort of go back through your history and take us on your journey to date, if you don't mind, so that the listeners understand where you've invested your time, energy and money to look at what the motivations were, what the learnings were, where it took you to, and then how it then got you back to where you are today, mate. So what I'd love to start with yourself, sort of having done a little bit of homework around your background, it seems that your good mother was pretty formative in the very early days in terms of instilling some pretty key qualities and characteristics and values that have probably underpinned everything you've done. Can we sort of go back to those very early days and share with us the good, the bad and the ugly moments and what you've learnt from them?
Yeah, definitely, mate. I come from, born and bred in southwest Sydney in Liverpool, and at the time, I was born into, my mum and dad were together when I was born. They were never married, but they were together. They bought their house, I think, in 1981 for $30,000, the same old, Sydney or Melbourne or Adelaide or Perth or Brisbane centric story, where it was dirt cheap back then and was ridiculous money now. But it was definitely obvious for me from a young person growing up in that area, where I was most certainly not privileged. My mum studied nursing. My dad ran a couple of small businesses time and time again, and most of them didn't succeed, which eventually probably led to part of the money stresses that went through my parents' family, or my parents' household at the time, and they separated when I was about 10. At that age, mate, I was at the point where I know my mum was probably struggling relatively heavily financially, but one thing my mum always was very much a kin, as well as my grandmother, who's passed away since, were both akin to very, very good values. That it wasn't necessarily the fact that, even though I knew money wasn't readily available in my household, I definitely didn't feel like I was missing out on life. And the vast majority of investment that my mum made in my life was time to me to be able to endeavour on everything I want to do. And for the vast majority of my youth was sport, and revolved a lot around sport and just being involved in that, which I owe a lot to, in the sense that from that I've also got lifelong friends who I wouldn't have had without that dedication there. And that's one thing I think, that upbringing and that value of investing time and investing it in the right areas. And it wasn't necessarily revolving around, we need to have a new car every 2 years, or we need to upgrade our house, and we need to concern ourselves with, necessarily brand name foods, to really drill down to that example. And I definitely recall my fair share of black and gold labelled food in the pantry.
It all tastes the same, mate.
Yeah, exactly, mate. And I think that really instilled, a bit more of a longer term ethos as far as what I have now factored into my lives. But I graduated through high school, and then at the end of high school, I was at a bit of a crossroads, as most people are at that stage, where trying to figure out what I actually wanted to do in my life, and took a fair bit of time figuring that out, which is probably partly what I think has led me to do what I do for a living. But I spent the best part of a year after graduating from high school surfing and trying to truly find what I wanted to do with life.
Yep.
And that led me to studying architecture for the best part of 2.5 years before there was a bit of a pivoting moment. I write a fair bit about it in my book, actually, with regards to me having my end of second year made major works of designing a 3.5, 4-story office building, which was on CAD at the time, which was
good
very hard.
CAD.
Yeah, there was no cloud technology, no autosave, etc. There wasn't even USBs back then, so it was always saving onto floppy disk and all that kind of thing that went with it. But my laptop got stolen but between my legs just before I was submitting that, literally for my end of year works at a bar at the Broadway Hotel. For everyone who knows Sydney and UTS very well, they'll know exactly where that pub's still located. Still don't know how it happened, to be honest with you, but it happened, and that was kind of that sliding doors moment where it led me to think, shit, that was 8 to 10 months of work. I don't necessarily know if I can go back and do it again. And that basically was a pivot then, where I took a bit more time off after that, reassessing if I wanted to continue another 3.5, 4 years worth of study and become an architect, which wasn't necessarily for the fact that the laptop got stolen. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't think I had it in me to actually put that kind of motivational study into becoming an architect. And I think that was probably the other part of why I didn't fulfill that.
Yeah, I mean, just jumping in there, because it was probably a blessing in disguise, to be honest, Paul. What you learnt in 2 years, it took me 17 years to work out. And I often say that, I still love architecture, but I hate the business of architecture. And, I've found myself in a position after 17 years where I was working 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, burnt my first marriage. And then it was then that I had to have a good look at myself and go, right, well, are you going to continue to do this and have no life outside of it, or wake up yourself and stop being, an architect version of Vincent van Gogh and starting to have a look at getting some time back to enjoy life. So it was probably a fairly smart recognition and at a fairly early stage in the game. But let me ask this question: why the interest in architecture, mate? What drew you towards that?
Yeah, it's funny that. I never grew up around. My dad was not a builder. We definitely didn't live in a house that inspired you from an architectural perspective. That's for sure.
Same, mate.
It's funny because one thing I was always fascinated in, I lived in an area which rapidly grew as far as population and then therefore new developments over the decades that I lived there when I was growing up. One thing I do remember distinctly is back before there was the actual construction fences that go up around building sites now, back then it was free reign. So as a kid trolling through new estates, I always had an interest, and I used to go with my mates just walking through houses that were half built and looking at properties that had integrated pools and all kinds of fancy things that I'd never seen before. And it just, for that stage, when I was about 10, 11, 12, was somewhat interested in it all, and it just fascinated me. And it wasn't necessarily something I carried through, but I was always interested in art as well. So I was a relatively decent drawer, and that's something I explored, just painting and general stuff that was creative. So that was the part that kind of made me a bit more, I guess, aligned to. There was a few things there that just interested me. Definitely not the money side of things, because I think that still is pretty unclear. It's like any professions, architects can earn a lot of money, but
not many, mate. I can tell you firsthand, there aren't many.
Yeah, bloody hard. I've got to say it quietly, because I actually work in conjunction with an architectural firm, so I'm very akin to how their office works, and I know it very well. And funnily enough, I do developments now on more higher end stuff, and I've got a joint venture partner who is my architect, who's my 50-50 joint venture partner in developments that I do now. And she's a registered, licensed, trained architect and worked for some very big firms. And I don't want to speak illy of it, just in case she does listen to this. But I know sort of where the money comes and goes, and it's not easy money.
Oh my God! I could ad nauseum on that subject, and as I say, I love the profession. But I think, and again, what I'm picking up here, probably again similar to myself, what comes out of that creative process, which is, I think, very important to anyone who's investing in property, actually, is the ability to visualise the future, which you become second nature when you're involved in that design space of visualising something in the future and then breaking it down and then strategically looking at, okay, how am I going to get from here to there step by step? So that sort of strategic, almost chess-like approach to life that's almost inbuilt in you is probably where I see it coming out in your attraction to architecture, but has probably also been very useful to you in terms of building your portfolio and the business that you're now in. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. I think there's a certain element of you. I think the most successful investors I speak with regularly are typically ones who have a fair bit of discipline. They have a very good long-term goal, but they have an element of creativity, and they are not rigid to the point where they can't move their mindset or change their strategy if the unforeseen or unexpected happens. And I think that's where the best elements of the best investors come in, is they have a relatively flexible mindset if need be, and they don't have a woe is me mentality when things go wrong. They say, well, I've got to figure out how to do something different here, and let's get figuring out on how to do something different and actually effectively make that change, which is a very key skill of the best investors I know.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of going to digress a little bit here, but while we've mentioned the subject, because I know you talk about this in quite some detail in your book, as I do in my own, about the importance of that mindset. Can you sort of give us a Reader's Digest bullet point version of what you believe some of the key qualities of successful investors are in terms of that mindset outlook, to expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it like, rather than probably delving too deep into the full psychology of it all, but again, I guess one thing that you and I are probably both very blessed with is the fact that we have the ability to look at successful investors and have very good friends and also acquaintances who are those people, and you kind of then can draw what are the similarities and what are the parallels between them all. And for me, it's always that they, first and foremost, is that they are typically very level-headed. And this is something that is easy to say, but very hard to actually achieve, I think, in life, is that they don't necessarily have a either boom or bust mentality with regards to what they do from their investment mentality, but also carry that through as a demeanour for everything else that they do as far as their decisions in life from a financial and non-financial perspective. And they're always thinking long-term. And rather than thinking, how do I make the money in the next 6, 12, 18 months, and how is that going to all of a sudden better my 3 or 5 year position, because I need for lack of a better sporting analogy, I need to hit a hook shot from halfway because that's my only option here, rather than people, playing a, for a cricket analogy again, I look at that, the best mindset that I want to see every investor take. And this can mean that you're either 50 and working towards a 65-year retirement plan, or a 25-year-old working towards your first investment that's a piece of a bigger 30-year plan, but playing it as a game of singles and getting to that 100 after a very boring knock of really good quality, well thought out shots, which are purchases which will fit a reason and go towards it. And every now and then you'll get something that will come up that will be a much better or much bigger 1, 2, 3 year worth of growth, or a development that all of a sudden can yield huge wins. But people, the best mindset that I see is that people are thinking, very, very very nerve-kept and very level-headed, as well as thinking long-term. And above all, they are always thinking about how can I afford to keep this asset base, and making sure that what their mindset is all about making sure that that's a fair weather as well as a rough weather mentality, and they're understanding that there's always going to be both sides of that equation when investing in property.
Yeah, I love it. Great analogies there too in terms of explaining that. Thanks, mate. Awesome. Now, you after losing your 12 months AutoCAD work and deciding that architecture's not for me, you jumped into the teaching fraternity, which also seems like quite a divergence of direction. Explain to us your thinking around then why you started to go down that track.
Yeah, well, if I go back to my youth again and my teenagehood, I constantly had it drummed into me that I would always make a great teacher. And I still don't really know why my mum and a lot of my friends and family around me at the time said that would be the case. But to be honest with you, I kind of succumbed to it and thought, well, if they think it's in me, then maybe I should just become one. So fast forward 3.5 years worth of another degree later, that's where I was. And I was 24 odd years old and with a teaching degree in hand. And at that stage, kind of looked at life and thought, well, not really knowing where it would take me, which clearly it didn't take me down that direction for very long. But at that stage as well, I was always very much an open spirit as far as, or free spirit in regards to where and what I wanted to explore in life. So pretty much straight after graduating from uni, I hopped on a plane to London and taught in the UK for the best part of 2 years in a whole bunch of different schools, and eventually was promoted to a head of department within about 8 months of being a teacher, which was a huge mistake for them and for me.
Why do you say that, mate?
Oh, mate, look, I was in a pretty rough school in part of East London. For anyone knows, the Woolwich Arsenal region, a bit further down towards Greenwich. It's but it is what it is. It was it was pretty much a very blue collar area, but it was a 1,200 kids school, and there was a PE department, which I was the head of the PE department at the time, which had obviously, when you're promoting a 24-year-old import who's been a teacher for 8 months as the head of department, you know things fundamentally probably aren't that great in the school. I think wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, thought, great, here we go, huge pay rise and a big responsibility. But soon after that, realised that I wasn't in the UK for a career choice. I was there to enjoy travel and to get the best out of that 2 years, where a bit of extra money did help, but in saying that, it also added about an extra 15 hours a week to what was a pretty relaxed teaching schedule and allowed me to travel a lot. So it probably stopped me from doing a fair bit of that. And I resigned from that job about a year into it, which was good. I mean, I got a hell of a lot out of it, leadership and learning how to lead, a staff of eight staff underneath me, and a whole bunch of things that came with that. But it was something that I realised that, an extra, call it 15,000 quid a year, which was a lot of money for me at the time for the job, but still I was like, well, I want to be able to travel because I'm going home in 2 years guaranteed. So let's just try to find something that's going to fit more of what I want out of this.
Yeah, well, here's the good news again, though, in sort of looking from the outside in accelerating your involvement in that. You've probably learned in 1 year what most people take 10 to recognise. So, it's diving in deep and slashing the floaties is, I know myself from my own experience, that's been when I've learnt the most and I've recognised the most and made the biggest shifts that have helped me long term, mate. So you did that, and then I think you were fortunate enough to meet your very good wife, Kim, as part of that exercise. So there's an added bonus there, obviously.
Well, that was it. So that's where we met over there on Australia Day. Within the first couple of months of being over there, I hosted the obligatory in UK Australia Day party at my house.
But you ended up on a plane trip back, and there was a bit of a bonus that put some unexpected cash in your pocket that probably gave you the basis to then start doing some other things, mate. Do you want to share that with us briefly?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It was a bit of another sliding doors moment in my life where coming back, I think at the time I had about best part of maybe 400 quid UK pound coming back to Australia. So I'd spent every penny I had on travelling and everything else with it. And pretty much at that time my visa was up, so I was on a plane irrespective of whether I wanted to go or not. And at that stage, I was on a Qantas flight booked for London to Sydney, and in the line, literally in the queue to check in, one of the Qantas stewardesses was walking down saying that if anyone's willing to come on the same flight tomorrow, we're overbooked. There is 4 spots available for business class tomorrow night at the Hilton, and an extra $1,000 traveller's check that can be cashed in Sydney. They said if anyone's willing to take it up, it's on offer. I couldn't have jumped at it quicker because I had nowhere to go, and I'd never stayed at the Hilton or in any 5-star hotel for that matter, and I'd never business class. So I ended up coming home with an extra $1,000 Aussie in my pocket, as well as a little bit of UK pounds, and that's where I started the journey from that point onwards, landing back in Sydney.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. And back in town, I know you sort of tracked it into the pharmaceutical sales arena for a while, which is very lucrative for many. And I've looked after a lot of investors in our own business that are on that track because they're very substantial incomes and horsepower to put into investment. So, but that can often become golden handcuffs as well. So talk us through your thinking around that, where that got you to, and then where property came in and why, if you don't mind, please, mate.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, graduating from university at the time, ironically enough, the dean of my university's husband was the head of sales for a large multinational pharmaceutical company, and he did an in-service for all graduates just before I left. And as part of that, he approached myself and 3 others as part of that back before I went to the UK, and basically offered us an entry-level sales role in pharmaceuticals. More so, he said, look, you've got exactly what we want out of it, and you're the people we want to come into these roles. It was very tempting at the time for me, and I thought, well, if I do that, I know I'm not going to travel, because ultimately, like you said, mate, it becomes a bit of a golden handcuffs and you jump on the corporate ladder and everything that goes with it. So I actually revisited that discussion when I got back, and pretty much within the coming months after that same person offered me pretty much the same job, which was unreal, and allowed me to really get an income level which I hadn't been able to attain or never would attain in the teaching fraternity. And that's really what allowed me to A, start to get the savings on board, and also B, start to get the ability to actually access funds from a bank perspective to then say, okay, I really want to now start to cement what I wanted to do probably a number of years back, and that's to start to think about property as my investment vehicle. So let me jump in there, because I'm always interested in why property, mate. So when did that thought come into your head? Why did it come into your head, and then where did that lead you to? Yeah, I actually thought property was always going to be for me the vehicle in some way, shape or form. And for me, the seed was planted probably back in my mid to late teens, when I know my mum at the time was sort of looking at her retirement position. And at that stage, there was a decision on her end, does she take a payout? She was in a government job, and did she take a payout from her super of a lump sum of a significant amount of money in her super as a lump sum, or did she take it as a defined benefit? She had a sliding doors moment then, which I don't necessarily think it was a bad decision. She ended up having a defined benefit scheme, which she's been retired and now has a guaranteed income for life. However, the other option was potentially take part of that as a deposit and then be able to buy an investment. And technically, she was talking with, at the time, I didn't really realise, but it was a financial planner who was probably not necessarily that untoward in what he was suggesting, and he was saying, look, there's probably an opportunity for you to buy at the time about $180,000-$200,000 investment nearby where we were. It wasn't brand new, but it was just a good established area, pretty simple house on a standard block within the western suburbs of Sydney. But fast forwarding about 10 years after that, reflecting back on what that would have meant, that property probably tripled in price in that 10-year time frame, and ultimately I think realising that would have put my mum on a completely different retirement trajectory at that stage as well, made me realise that, well, if you can have that amount deposit and you have that amount of time for that property to be in the market, although my mum was having that discussion in her mid to late 50s, I was thinking about, well, if imagine you had that discussion in your early 20s or mid 20s or even early 30s or mid 30s or even your 40s, and looking at what that would mean from a long-term compounded growth return position, and sort of doing the numbers for myself over the months and years after that, realising, shit, there's a pretty big upside here if you can get it done right and you can accumulate more than one asset. So it was sort of all think about how do you get to the position of how can you accumulate more than just one asset. It always come back down to you need deposits and you need to balance your cash flow when you need to balance your cash flow.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, no, I love it. So they were sort of sitting there as an AC, just waiting for the opportunity for you to have the income that would allow you to prove to the banks that you don't need their money, but you need their money to get into the property side.
Exactly.
Talk to us about that then. So you're earning good coin in the farmer sales fraternity. What was your sort of the first dipping the toe into the property arena, mate? Talk us about that.
Yeah, so it was a time where we knew we had access to about 400 Ks worth of, this is between my wife, my girlfriend and wife and I at the time, where we knew we had access to about 300 or 400 Ks worth of borrowing capacity. And for us, the assessment was, well, what is this going to mean? We were obviously renting at the time. That wasn't necessarily a concern, and the whole rent vesting scenario was something that wasn't touted. And as you and I have spoken to off air, it's not necessarily a term that was probably bandied around even more than 5 years ago, especially when you were doing it and I was definitely still am doing it. But it was something that we were considering, where will we get the best bang for our buck for this asset base or for this price point, and then how is that property or that purchase going to put us on a next level trajectory? So we assessed for about 3 or 4 months different markets, different options, and at the time we were talking late 2008, 9, 10, when the Sydney market and Melbourne markets in particular were probably feeling the full effects of the fallout of the GFC, as well as seeing a much more opportunistic market at the time where there was minimal supply, really low vacancy rates. The market hadn't shifted for the best part of 7 or 8 years off the back of the 2000 and 2003 cycle that came through back then. And after assessing starting a bit more around the country, and then assessing and saying, well, we know our backyard, we know where we're living, and as well as it looks fundamentally now that this is actually realistically a very good opportunity to get into this market.
You would have been quite a contrarian at the time, though, and I love this because I'm of a similar ilk. For example, when the GFC came through, I jumped straight on a plane and went to the States, and we bought 3 properties in the States because this is a lifetime opportunity. So where everyone else is going, no, it's all over for property. It's never going to happen. The sky's falling in. Let's get out. Yeah, well, you're bright enough to see, because it's almost a perfect storm that you were coming through at the time in that regard, and you had the courage and the fortitude to go, right, there's an opportunity here. How did you avoid that noise? Because there would have been a lot of negative noise from the media and everyone else saying, what are you doing? How did you reconcile that, yourself and Kim, in your own head?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. And I think the other thing at that time, I didn't have anyone around me, necessarily friends or family, at that stage who were actually jumping in, and it was still for them. They were all renting where they wanted to live. They were all living a bit of a faster lifestyle, etc. And for me, it was trying to figure out, how do we pivot here and still get that, and still live our lives and have a lot of fun and live on all the kinds of things. But how do we actually say this is the right decision, to be confident and stand by what these decisions are going to mean? And for us, it came down to, for me, 2 particular people. And I had 2 people who are still around me today who are absolutely key, in the sense that one is a really good friend of mine who is also a broker. Funnily enough, mate, to your comment, he's American. He's an Australian citizen now, but migrated over here about 10 or 15 years ago on the back of the GFC, worked heavily in the commercial space over there, ended up meeting an Australian bird, came over here to Sydney, and the rest is history there. But as part of that, he's super clever, really relaxed, and we became really best mates, and we surf a lot together now. But he was looking at it from a similar position on his side, as well as another really good friend of mine who also started his investment journey at that time, and both had access not only to the funds, but also had access to previous cycles, as well as probably more the information about what this means. And it took months and rounds of conversation about, what does this mean now? What is this going to mean for the next 5 years? What is this going to mean for the next 20 years, as far as the time in the market, access to funds, and a relatively easy way to borrow money back then as well, is that what's going to be the flow on when you get easy credit. It typically means ultimately get a lot more people with credit, which puts pressure on prices, because more people are hunting, and we had a high population growth, we had a decent economy, etc., etc. So it was probably trying to drown out the people who were the naysayers. There weren't that many of them in my life at the time, to be honest with you.
Good.
Up until I probably had a few more than one property, and that's when I started to get people saying, what the hell are you doing? But that was a fair way after, and by that time I was very confident in what I was doing anyway, so it didn't really matter. But in the early stages, I had some pretty key people around me, and I think that's always very much testament to really successful investors, is there's usually more than just them who help them get to that position.
Yeah, 100%. I've always said that success in any endeavour is an elite team sport. And if you often you're not even a player if you can surround yourself with people that are better than you, learn from them, but then manage your managers, then that gives you the time back to do other things while you've got great people making it happen for you. Yeah, love it, mate. So tell us about that first property then. So you're obviously with the big incomes, you're stashing the deposits away for your first. What does the first look like? What did you do? What sort of property was it? What was the strategy? What was your thinking? What was the property going to help you do at that point?
Yeah, so as much as we were sort of debating, do we keep saving for another couple of years and get a bigger deposit, get on that pathway, or do we take, and this is part of it, do we take the opportunity, which was a first homeowners grant at the time back in New South Wales, which was a stamp duty exemption plus about $7,000 to throw at it, and it wasn't for new only property back then.
Yep.
So we had the opportunity to probably save the best part of $20,000. I only had about $20,000 deposit, to be fair, at the time, which was best part of about 5% deposit. Plus, I had stamp duty exemptions as well as a grant that came in on top of it. And we landed on a renovation opportunity property in a beachside suburb of Cronulla, which I, funnily enough, still live in. And that's
good surf spot.
Yeah. And I mean, it was partly selfish in the sense that we knew Sydney was going to be the market, and we assessed it right across the board. But we knew that this first purchase, to get that exemption, we thought, well, it's going to be a 6-month live-in. And as part of that time, we maximised the opportunity by doing more or less a full-scale renovation, using the best part of those grants as the cash to actually fund the renovations themselves as well. So there's probably about 12 to 14 grand's worth of renos that happened there. Most of it was done cheap through sweat equity and a lot of late nights and weekends, etc. So a bit of sacrifice I went through that. But we purchased a 2-bedroom, ground floor, pretty open plan apartment, walking distance to the beach and all amenities for about 385 odd grand at the time, which isn't chicken feed. 10 years ago, it's still not chicken feed, but knew at the time if the property were to be a tenanted investment, it was still going to rent for about $450 a week at that time. Really low strata, small block, red brick, no lifts, no gyms, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And part of that upswing of that renovation is that we ended up getting revalued 6 months after at touch over $450.
Nice.
So we ended up being able to draw out that equity, and from that point, that was really when we got on the conveyor belt and starting to more or less try to replicate that formula for at least the next 2 or 3 investments in a short period of time.
Yeah, so obviously your sort of purchase price, affordability, and that location would have driven the unit approach. You continue with units in that sort of vicinity with your next... No?
Yeah, so that's where we sort of looked at and assessed it, and it came down to serviceability and ultimately finance as well as cash flow from there onwards. So one thing we did after that was we moved out of that property. We kept it, but moved out of it and rented, and pretty much knew that would allow us to get our serviceability right up, as well as get us some income. So we moved out of that, rented just around the corner, improved our serviceability exponentially, as well as dragged out about 30, 40 grand's worth of equity from there.
Nice.
And that's when we went on a bit more of a buying spree of 3 assets within about the next 18 months and repeated a formula. So that ended up being another 2-bedroom ground floor villa in Mount Druitt, so very western suburbs, classic area of blue-collar working class, but did see some very significant upswings. But ultimately, that was intentionally there because we needed cash flow to be able to keep our serviceability up. So that was about an 8.5% yield at the time.
Wow.
Which was a walk-in, exactly the same deal. We needed about 8 grand spent on it from renovation. So we did a 1.5-week renovation on the property from top to bottom, new kitchen, bathroom, floors, paint, works, tenant back in place at about a bit over 8% after we'd done that. It's pretty close to 9%, as well as then we were able to recycle equity out of that, and then took about 25k from that 180. I think it was 180 to be purchased there. Was refinanced, I think, at about 225 after our renovation. Took out as much as we could from that. We're happy to pay lenders mortgage insurance. Happy to capitalise that on there because we knew that this was acquisition phase and we weren't being super conservative. And that led into a purchase of a corner block house in Campbelltown. On Sydney as well.
Love it. Just jumping in there, I think you've raised a really good point because a lot of would-be investors trip themselves up over this whole lender's mortgage insurance exercise, and I know myself that growth was the driver. So everything I did early on was all about growing the capital base. So I needed to get the asset base to the the position it needed to be. So I had no qualms paying lenders and mortgage insurance. In fact, my first property was a 97% plus LMI, which meant that it ended up at 102% lending factor, which meant I only had to pay the stamps and the other bits and pieces on it. But it was about accessing the asset base. And mortgage insurance is, if you've got a good accountant, he'll write that off over 5 years anyway. So,
Exactly.
So I often say to would-be investors, don't trip yourself up over the lender's mortgage insurance because putting together a 20% deposit plus the 5 or 6% on costs is going to take you years, and that's years out of the market that you could otherwise be enjoying the growth for the property that you've managed to get yourself into. And if you're minimising the deposits, you can buy more of them. So, sorry, mate, I didn't want to disrupt your flow, but I think you made a really good point there in terms of recognising the benefit of doing that.
Yeah, and it's a key part because you talk about how do you build a portfolio where you can build it, over a very long period of time, or if you have the opportunity. And at the time, I was in my 20s, I didn't have necessarily the high risk of what happens if all goes wrong and I can start again. And I think that has to also be part of the consideration. But for the most part, capitalising your lender's mortgage insurance, understanding the tax effectiveness of that, understanding that increases your total capital base, as long as you manage your cash flows and you know that, what are the mitigating risks if things go wrong, can you still hold this asset base and all the other things you need to factor in. For me, it's an enabler, and you have to do your cost assessment on is that going to enable you to do far more, unless the alternative is you sit on the sidelines for another 3 to 5 years to save the equivalent deposit and not pay it. And the opportunity costs, on my position, if I didn't go down that pathway, I wouldn't be where I am talking to you right now.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the other thing about sitting on the sidelines is that, if the market's in the right part of the cycle and it's increasing, then you're chasing your tail because the more you save, the more you've got to save, and then you're on the sidelines for longer. So
definitely.
That's really, and a really key word. I love that word, is an enabler, because this is what it's about. It's about using as little of our own money, accessing as much of someone else's to secure the asset base, so you can actually enjoy that growth ride, assuming you're getting the right property in the right location at the right time.
Yeah, agreed.
So love that, mate. That's awesome. So you put some of these together, and I'm assuming, making a massive assumption here, that growth is in the back of your head. It's about asset growth. Is that what the conscious thinking was? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was about maximising my asset base as well as factoring in. I mean, to be fair, I didn't expect the growth to come as quick and rapid as it did across what ended up being about 7 assets across the Sydney market over about a 3-year period of time in 2010, 11, 12, 13.
Yep.
But in saying that, the first few years, there was zero growth in those assets right across the board. The growth that came was manufactured. But it was also a time where, bank valuations were probably a hell of a lot more lenient. It was a time where I maximised what I could get out of a valuation by doing a sensible, cost-effective renovation. So that's what enabled us to get the recycle of equity going, as well as obviously our incomes and our deposits that we're saving in the background. So we're still living thrifty, we're still living well within our means. I drove a $1,500 car that I bought when I got fresh off the plane back in 2008. I drove that for the best part of 7 years, even though I was on a well and truly 6-figure income and everything was fine from an income perspective from the home front. It was just, that's the part that I've stayed true, and that's probably part of what I talk about with my upbringing, is that I have never fascinated over owning anything more from a car perspective. Again, not to say that that's not what needs to drive people, because I think each to their own in that space, but that did mean that I didn't restrict what I could do because of the fact that I had this huge debt on some bad, or a huge mortgage on some bad debt out there.
Yeah, well, let's dig into that piece now, and we'll come back to the portfolio, because I think, again, you've touched on a really key thing, and that's the reason why you're investing in the first place. And what I'm liking about what I'm hearing and what I've read in your book is quite a unusual recognition of what's important to you around lifestyle and how much that lifestyle costs, and what are the key things that are part of happiness and fulfillment and freedom for you. So can you expand on that a bit for us in terms of, and let's perhaps paint a picture for me, if you don't mind,
definitely,
on what your ideal lifestyle looks like, what that does cost you a year, and therefore what sort of an asset base that you've been building that's going to give you that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I'm very, very akin to my numbers, and I know exactly what my life costs are, which is nice for me because it also allows me to be very, very specific in any strategic investment decision I make in my life. But for me, and again, I don't like to pigeonhole people and say this is what you should aspire to, because I definitely don't think that my why is the same as most others, and nor should it be. But for me, with two young kids, I've got a 2 and a 5-year-old and a wife, and I'm in my mid-30s, and I'm at the point in life where I've got a lot of time, and I know that, and I've probably been privileged enough to know that time is something that we just can't take for granted. And I lost my old man last year, and I know full well that he didn't have time, and that was mainly financially driven. Is that he ended up working right till he died,
Wow.
and he never got to enjoy it. And my wife's father passed away 3 years ago by an unexpected diagnosis of terminal cancer, which killed him in 4 months after being diagnosed. And he'd literally retired at the age of 60, about a month before he got the diagnosis. And it's not that I want people to think this could happen to anyone, but it also is the fact that, for me, I don't want to be in the position where I'm 65 and all of a sudden saying I can finally now potentially have my home paid off, and now I can go and live a really privileged life, where I don't want to get in the position where I need much more than what I've got right now. So for me, it's all about how do I get as much time as possible, and what does that time cost me? So, spending as much time with my kids. I coach my boys soccer a couple of times a week. I live literally 2 minutes from where my office is, and my boy goes to school on the same street as we live. My daughter goes to kindy, the same street as where we live. We play soccer down the road. Our beach is a walk down the beach, down our kilometre down the road to go for a surf. And for me, we sort of built our life around where we live, and we want to be able to just explore as much time as we possibly can. So that for me is always saying, how do I get away from what I don't want to do and spend as much time as what I want to do? And that's not necessarily just being completely self-indulgent, saying I want to go surfing for 5 hours a day by myself, because that still doesn't really fulfill me, as much as I don't mind doing it every now and then. But it's, for me, it's just being able to be at home when my kids need me at home, being able to be at sport when my kids need me at sport, being able to be a decent husband to my wife, and go out and have a couple of drinks and a dinner when we can, because we can afford to have the time as well as the cash flow. For me, the number that we need, and we've drilled this down to do it on an annual basis. We do it every 6 months between my wife Kim and I, is that we need about $110,000 to $115,000 a year, and potentially, if we want to blow out with an extra holiday a year with the family, we might need $120,000 to $130,000 a year income to actually fulfill the life that we have right now. Now, that's not to say that that's a number that most people need to have, but that's a number that we need to have, excluding our mortgage repayments, as well as living the same lives that we are. And I'd say that we live a life of not necessarily indulgence, but I don't skimp on things. I just still don't have any fancy cars and stuff like that I need in my life. But I do know that that's exactly what we need post-tax, what we need net on an annual basis. And that really was a number that we kind of were aspiring to from an early point, is that we kept rolling those numbers to keep figuring out what do we buy that's going to fit the cash flow, that's going to fit the growth, that's going to fit us to pay down this debt, that's going to keep allowing us to get closer and closer to getting that 120 or 130 grand a year income.
Love it, mate. Well, it's again another amazing parallel. That magic number of 120 is. I did a lot of research around that when I wrote my own book, The Freedom Formula, and that was the number that I came up with that
Awesome.
Gives someone a really comfortable existence without being extravagant, but you can still go overseas and you can still enjoy a pretty comfortable lifestyle. And in pretty simple maths, that really means you just need to create about 2.4 mil worth of income producing assets that are going to give you that. So
exactly.
Is that the similar maths that you're doing around?
Pretty much, mate. Yeah, look, I mean, and that's kind of, if I was to share my own numbers at the moment, I mean, I think my portfolio, without sort of saying what we've done, or we can dig into a bit deeper, what we've done since acquiring the first round of assets is we probably bring in about, I think, somewhere around about 170 grand income from the portfolio now, and out of that, we basically have no debt against it. So for us now, it's sort of managing the portfolio, it's managing the assets, and it's kind of, that's the job, is just making sure they tick over, they stay tenanted, we keep them up to date and safe and tenant friendly. But for us, the strategy is kind of looking at how do we reduce the capital base, as well as then doing a bit more of the fun stuff, which I'm sort of more involved in these days, is looking at active developments, because I can do it. And that wasn't necessarily something I was exploring earlier in the piece.
Yeah, so let's go there because, again, similar parallel. Having been an architect, I'm very, very comfortable in the build space, and our first run of property, similar to yourself, were cheapies, more in South Australia, so the houses on a block in good rental yield areas that had plenty of potential. But I then woke up through a very good accountant to the benefits of going down the build road in terms of that cash flow affordability piece, which has made a massive difference to the ongoing holding of the portfolio. What attracted you into the build space, and how has that benefited you and Kim personally since you've been doing that?
Yeah, definitely. Look, we've done a number of different builds, like right from the early renovations through to subdivisions, construction of second dwellings, right through to more higher end 1 into 4 lots, multi-dwellings, and literally just signed off on a option only last week for the biggest development that I'm going to have done to date, which will be about over a 3 mil purchase on the land and probably about a 4 mil development on the properties, which has led me. It's always been a graduation. And for me, it comes down to the graduation of really understanding the feasibility on not only what it costs to buy, what it costs to build, and what are all the ins and outs in between, but also where is the appetite for what I'm going to build in that market, understanding truly what the council LEP is going to allow me to do, and not necessarily trying to jump into becoming a huge developer within 6 months just because I've got a bit of architecture history. Doesn't make me a genius, and far from it. So I think the fact that I went from replacing carpets, floorboards, kitchens, to moving toilets and some plumbing, through to then doing full-scale renovations top to bottom on houses, to then building granny flats, to then doing subdivisions, to then doing multi-dwelling subdivisions, and then higher-end blue-chip stuff, happened over a 10-year period. And for me, it's always been about having, again, it goes back to this, is having a team around me. I'm still, personally speaking, I'm still just an enabler, and I'm kind of still just the project. I'm the property finding person as well as the money man, and that's the way I sort of see my role is I'm very good at enabling things to happen, but I don't have necessarily the full technical skills to fulfill any part of the development, and hence why I just rely on the experts in every single field.
Yeah, I love that. So, I mean, I often describe myself as an orchestra leader. All you've got to do is sing a few bars of the song to me, and then I'm going to assemble the instruments and the musicians and turn those few bars into a symphony by making sure you've got the sort of right people in the right place at the right time to look after you. And then you can just sit back and listen to it and enjoy the music while you get on doing what's important to you with your friends and family.
Yeah, mate, bang on, and that's sort of where it's all led to. And I think it also mitigates, to the most part, you can never mitigate risk, full stop, especially when developing. But I think it really, truly makes sure that you're not trying to get too big too fast. And the amount of people who are, developing developments and developers get a very good, I guess, rap within a lot of the fast money and the BRWs, etc. But I'll tell you what, if I'd love to see some sort of BRW fast losers instead of the fast starters. A lot more of them who have lost money than made money, and that's in any market, to be honest with you.
And I totally agree with you. On the research that I've done, and I'm a consistent student of this, there's only about 5% of investors who are actually what I would call successful. And the ones who jump in gung-ho into the building side of things can get themselves into a lot of hot water. And the ones that I think where it's a little bit misleading for a lot of first-timers, they just do the quick maths and go, there's good money to be made here, but they haven't factored in the capital gains tax and the holding cost side of the equation, which can really bite into things when things take a lot longer than they expected to. But in saying that, as you've really well pointed out, if you're surrounding yourself with proven professionals in each and every aspect that are aware of all that, can carry you through that, then there are some very significant benefits, both from a manufacturing equity, but also from that ongoing holding cost, which is, that ongoing holding cost is something I just see a lot of investors don't spend enough time thinking through. And they jump into it and it all looks good, and 2 or 3 years in, it's they can't go on the holiday, they can't go to the pub on Friday because this thing hasn't been set up the right way, and it's burning a hole in their pocket, and they throw their arms up, sell it, way prematurely and lose money on it and then go, oh, this property thing's not for me. Whereas surrounding yourself with people like yourself and others in that sort of fraternity, you can do extremely, extremely well and have a very good lifestyle as the portfolio does its work.
Agreed.
So, yeah, no, that's awesome, mate. So, okay, so talking that through then, you're now sort of paralleling the journey here. At what point in that portfolio did you decide, right, I've had enough of this pharmaceutical sales thing? And was that because you're just, again, back on the treadmill, working massive hours and not having spare time? Or I'm just interested in why you decided, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I need to get some time back doing something where I'm in control of my own destiny. What was the thinking around that?
Yeah, it was definitely probably column A, which was working hard, doing lots of hours, earning good money, but realizing that corporate and earning good money doesn't come for free, and that they always want their pound of flesh out of it, and rightly so. In my opinion, people shouldn't be paid exorbitant amounts of money unless they're actually delivering value, whether it's ROI for the company or whether it's just putting hours in, full stop. And then second to that was the fact that I think after doing what I was doing personally in my own portfolio for the best part of 5 to 8 years and getting then to the level of having a passive income that was coming from it and a significant amount of equity that came from it, on top of that, seeing a lot of people come to me, both friends, family, and kind of eventually people I didn't know, saying, I want to talk to you about property investing, and then realizing at that time buyers agencies were not really readily known either. So I wasn't necessarily saying I want to become a buyer's agent because that's what I aspired to be way back when. And as you said when you first introduced me, is that the East Coast now does have a number of buyer's agents, and unfortunately I think some of them do come out of the woodwork quite quickly with probably far less of a pedigree than what they should to be able to pass on any kind of investment opportunities to anyone to buy. However, it was the crossroads that I was at. I was at a bit of a conundrum where I knew I was traveling a lot for work. I was tired. I wasn't necessarily enjoying the money that I was earning, and then I thought to myself, well, I've got the actual balance of properties as far as my portfolio is concerned. I had a really good base there, so I knew if I didn't need the income to build my portfolio any further, I actually didn't need the income anymore to buy. So that was something that was good for me to say I don't need to get any more exposure if I didn't want to. So as well as the fact that I had a passive income of, not necessarily what I needed, but I knew I had something that was going to probably subsidise a good 20% of what I would if I hypothetically went and became a teacher again. But I knew leaving the corporate pharmaceutical profession, I didn't do it without going into wanting to start this business. I didn't just walk away and say, what do I want to do? I definitely spent basically the best part of 6 months towards the back end of my corporate career figuring out, is there a viable business in what I want to do, and ultimately getting all of the concessions in place and put there appropriately for me to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to take the leap and I'm going to work in the space that I really enjoy and what I know I'm really, really good at. And then eventually, the best part of 5 years ago, handed in my resignation and then started pure property investment from that day onwards.
Yeah, okay. And here's something that I'd like to dig into a little bit as well, because, again, another parallel between you and I in making the transition into, moving into the property space full time. I know from some of the reading I've done, we've both given that sort of planning approach, war chested ourselves so that we're aware that the first couple of years is going to be pretty tight, but we've set things up that we've got cash reserves and cash buffers that have come out of the portfolio, and or probably supplemented by Kim working to pay the bills during that process, so that you're not sort of leaping off the cliff and then suddenly finding yourself in a position where you're not earning any income. The banks won't touch you because you're self-employed and your accountant makes sure you don't declare much income. Yep. Can you sort of talk a little bit more around that transition and the thinking and how you've actually sort of given yourself that insurance policy to last a distance long enough for the business to really start paying the bills?
Yeah, for sure, mate. And I think it's such a vital thing, and I think it's such a big thing that the amount of times that no doubt your listeners are going through right now to say, geez, there's so many days that I'd just love to just quit what I do and start a business, which unfortunately or fortunately is something that can be very, very financially beneficial, but also geez, I tell you what, starting a business is also partly, it's basically choosing to have another child if anyone's had children.
That's a great analogy, mate. I reckon it's having, I reckon it's more like triplets than having one, actually.
Unexpected triplets, yeah, whoops, there we go. But look, mate, I think that point of knowing and being well prepared and knowing how the finances work, and also, going back to my work team around me, i.e. my broker, working with him for the best part of 6 months to scrape together all of my valuations and get everything released in lines of credit available against all these facilities. I think, refinanced 8 separate properties over a 6-month period of time. Not that I was going to spend the money, but knowing full well that I wanted to be in a position where I could still not necessarily cash flow my business, because I wasn't necessarily paranoid about that. It was probably more, I don't want to stop my property investment position.
Yeah.
And I was actually gearing up for a development at that time. So I literally quit my job and developed a property within a 6-month period.
Yeah.
And that was only due to the fact of sort of having the foresight that I'm not going to be able to borrow money from the banks for at least 12 months on a good year.
Yeah.
And more like probably 2 years if the business does okay. And that's what I spent that time making sure that those facilities are available.
And was Kim working at that time, so you had some sort of steady income flowing through regardless?
Yeah, look, she was, but in saying that, we had just had our second kid. We just had our first kid at that time. So she was going on mat leave for a period of time, but she was a teacher, full-time teacher, so we knew that there was, pretty much guaranteed scenarios as far as income, mat leave, and then going back to work and all those kinds of things. And probably overall, the biggest thing that I probably don't talk about enough, but she was most certainly, and Kim is one of the biggest enablers for me as well, is that support from her. As much as I don't talk about it that much, she's most certainly a 50-50 partner in all of our decisions that we make and across the board, as well as being above all just supportive. And you don't get to be able to make those huge life impacting decisions without support.
100% there, mate. Music to my ears, because my good wife Sonia and I are almost, we're yin and yang, so very different, but the combination of the two is massive in terms of.
Yep.
I'd come up with 1,000 ideas, and Sonia will go, yeah, well, that's already good, but we need to do this, and it's like, yeah, great, yeah, 100%. Yeah. So that sort of balancing exercise, but most importantly, I think, and again, interested in your thoughts on this, the sense of support and sense of confidence of knowing that we're in it together, and regardless of what the outcome is, it's going to be okay, gives you the courage and the resilience to go, right, let's have a crack at this. Would I be right in saying that, mate?
Yeah, definitely, mate. I think it's everything. I owe everything to that, and vice versa. Kim's very, very receptive of the fact that we wouldn't have got there without the coming up with the ideas. And like I said, you've got to have that balance of yin and yang. And I think the best couples, whether they're husband and wife, wife and wife, husband and husband, or even just business partners in general, I find that's the part where you see that most of the time there's usually a bit of a counterbalance in both those people, and they rebound different ideas. They've usually got different perceptions on what makes a good idea and a bad idea, but they usually balance themselves out very well and can challenge each other respectfully most of the time as well.
Yeah, beautifully said, mate. Absolutely beautifully said. Yeah, okay, so we're jumping into the buyer's agent space, and pure property investment came to life. I'd love to dig in a little bit deeper now into buyer's agents, because while they have become pretty much flavour of the month in the eastern states in particular, they are quite fledgling in other areas of the country. I'm a big believer and a big supporter of the buyer's agent space, because I think someone who is independent of the buying process eliminates the emotion that often gets in the way of good decisions anyway. But the negotiation skills that come through a good buyer's agent can make a massive difference in dollars to the end result. So can you sort of give us a download, if you don't mind, on what separates a good buyer's agent from the others? And would love you to talk through why someone who's jumping into the property space would engage a buyer's agent over doing it themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a few good examples I'll give on the latter in a second. But for me, buyer's agency space, rather than trying to go to a buyer's agent to be your guru or your oracle as far as they hold all the secrets and they're going to tell you exactly which suburb or property type to buy, that's going to be the answer to all your financial woes. I think ultimately what a good buyer's agent does, fundamentally, to what you alluded to yourself, mate, was that we really need to be agnostic to any properties or any markets until we truly understand the motivation and the current situation of that particular investor.
Yeah.
And that's really what we spend a lot of time up front with every client that we work with before they even want to use our services, is understanding where they're at, how long they have, what cash flow, what borrowing capacity, what other assets, what liabilities are in the portfolio, and ultimately what are they trying to achieve. So once we understand that, our role is to then say, well, based on that, here are the markets and the property types that we want to focus on for that next or for that first investment. And we spend a hell of a lot of time and money on research to actually then go into those markets and source and secure an asset which fits those exact parameters based on the price, the property type, cash flow, etc. And for us, that's typically per client, that's about somewhere between a 6 to 10 week process from the first conversation to actually securing a property that fits the bill. And even on top of that, probably about 90% of all purchases we make are in those markets are actually off market. And that's the part which, our buying capacity and our knowledge and our ability to actually get those assets for our clients that aren't advertised and B, have a huge motivation to sell, is really what we're trying to achieve. And people will sometimes balk at the fact that they're paying a fee for service. But for me, the biggest thing there is making sure that we're completely independent of, we don't care which property a client of ours buys as long as it's good value. And really, for us, that value and that appropriateness of their portfolio is why, for us, a flat fee is always going to be how we get incentivized. And I want to make sure that every client of ours is getting our fee as well as ideally an additional amount on top of that made back upon settlement. So I see what we do as, in all, a very good insurance policy above everything, is that you're not making mistakes in what you do.
Yeah, no, it's spot on. It's spot on, particularly for time poor professionals who have an interest in property and the sort of the traditional approach I see with a lot of do-it-yourself investors is they just go out and look for a home like the one they're living in, and it's quite often in their backyard, and that's generally the worst basis upon which to decide on what to invest in. But let's put a very quick little bit of shape around this as an example. And I know, I don't want a Constantine or a 6 to 10 week process into 2 minutes. But let's say I rocked up to you and I said, "Okay, Paul, I've had a chat to my broker based on equity and my borrowing capacity, and I can afford $100 to $150 a week. I know that I can comfortably buy a place for around about $500,000. I'm going to invest for 20 years minimum, and I ideally would like to be getting a 3 to 4 bed home with a couple of bathrooms and 1 or 2 garages with a little bit of a backyard. So I'm really accessing the family market. Where should I be starting to hunt at that purchase price, assuming that it's all about growth for me, affordable growth? What would your initial thoughts be around that?
Yeah, good question, mate. Because I think you painted a really relatively not necessarily say a normal picture, but I think that's a picture that we do see a lot of. And I think if someone came to me with that sort of level of understanding of their current position as well as what they want, that would be refreshing, because I think it then allows us to say, okay, well, you're already 60, 70, maybe 80% there as far as what you know and what fits. I would always usually challenge, and as part of our process, we challenge them to say, well, is this first, or is this potentially going to be one of many properties? And if we've got as you said, a surplus cash flow of $100, $150 a week, if we go and spend that on a growth asset that might cost that hold, is that going to sacrifice your ability to maybe not be able to buy that second, third, fourth or fifth asset that you might want to be aspiring to? And if that's all going to be good and well, and we still are happy with saying, look, we're happy with a shortfall of 100, 150 a week, then our role is to typically come back to that client based on our data to say, look, here's probably going to be somewhere between 2 and 3 separate markets which we feel are going to fit that 20-year growth objective, that are going to fit that asset type, that are going to fit major metro markets that we're comfortable with, that are going to have some good risk mitigation. And then we'd usually have a bit of a Q&A around which of those markets are going to fit. We might actually end up running searches simultaneously across 2 or 3 markets for a lot of clients as well.
Yeah, love it, mate. And you'd sort of adopt a fairly borderless approach to that exercise now, given the access to data and people, mate?
Absolutely, yeah. Look, for us, Australia is always going to be our market, and where in Australia is going to be dictated by both the time that we are in at that point, but also on the budget, on the objective, on the strategy. And, right now we're buying properties across 4 different states and across multiple different price points for different reasons. And that's the beauty about Australia. And I think if anyone's literally just looking within 10, 20, 50 Ks of their own home, because that's kind of what they can access on a weekend to pound the pavement, I think they're doing themselves a huge disservice.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. That's very good advice, mate. Awesome, mate. Well, I feel like we're only scratching the surface here, but I am mindful of your time, and I reckon we're opening the door here for a episode 2 with yourself at some point. Paul. I think there's a lot of other areas that we could really dig deep in on, given our common interest there. But, mate, I just want to sort of shift gears into what I like to affectionately call the ambush session, where I get you to tap dance to 5 quick questions that the listeners always want to get your thoughts around. So kicking straight into that, mate, what's your favourite quote and why?
Mate, I'm probably going to paraphrase it completely incorrectly here, but this one that I try to live by is that you are what you repeatedly do, and therefore excellence is not here we go, I'm losing it. It is not a something, but a something. And I'm missing the end there. I'll revise it to much more simple, which is that the Lee Trevino, I think, is the dumbed down version of it, is that the more I practice, the luckier I get. And ultimately, for me, that's what rings true a lot of the time. The first one was an Aristotle quote, just so I know that for much, but I know I paraphrase it incorrectly all the time. But I do know that the more I practice, the luckier I get. It's one that I do like to live by. Yeah,
I 100% agree. It's the and that's the interesting thing. I'm sure you see it as well, given that you've enjoyed some good success in property, but that's not an overnight sensation. That's at least, what I'm hearing from what we've talked about, it's at least a 10-year journey for you.
Agreed.
So, which is the important piece, because, and I think that applies to any endeavour. And just while we're on that subject, something I always like to ask the guests on Get Invested is, and I know your answer to this, but because I've read it in the book, but how would you define, or what do you think are the secrets to long-term sustainable success? And I emphasise that word sustainable, Paul, because you can have overnight success or one night stand or a one-hit wonder exercise, but sustainable success is a completely different thing. Can you just give us a little bit of a rundown on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think with the sustainable side of things is for me setting your barometer to exactly where you are happy and realising that spending more money on things that might be effectively, in inverted commas, bad debt are not going to make you any happier. And I think if you don't change that barometer, i.e. you're not going to go aspire to a waterfront or that 4th trip to the Maldives per annum, then for me the sustainable success comes with being boring and being comfortable that what the pathway you're on as part of growing that portfolio is something you're going to stay on, even when you do have the financial successes of having a property portfolio for 15, 20, 30 years. So for me, being as absolutely level-headed and boring and managing your cash flow, it couldn't be any more simple than that. I think if you want to try and think outside the box, then you're usually going to be getting your fingers burned, because people are trying to find ways to manufacture money in a 12 to 24-month period, where in property, if you're making your money in a year, then look, you're either very, very lucky, or typically you're going to be very, very unlucky, because if it's going to come that quickly, it'll usually go that quickly.
Yeah, that very well said. Mate, jumping into the reading exercise, because having written a book, I'm sure you've done a lot of reading over time. What would be the top book that you would recommend people read and why? And I guess let's give yourself a plug. There's you've written a really good book, A Surfer's Guide to Property Investment. I reckon it's a really good read. So for those who haven't picked that up one, make sure you do. I've downloaded the Kindle and had a really good read, and I guess that's where I realised fully just how parallel our thinking is around how I approach to life and investment. But what else, mate? Apart from that, what else would you suggest people grab and have a read of?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot and I think depending on which way your mindset goes, if you want it to be a mindset, or the way your preferences go, rather, if you want it to be more of a mindset type of book or a practical application book or a blend of both, I think both your book, both mine, there's a few other good Australian authors I know that have done or released some really good books that are practical. The Barefoot Investor stuff I think is really good fundamentally for people who practically want to understand money management. I know Ben and Bryce Holdaway have both written some two very good books on both the money management side as well as asset selection side.
Yeah.
One thing that I find, so there's a book which a lot of your readers might have already seen, which is written by Tony Robbins, which is Money Master the Game. Is an absolute novel of a book. It's enormous, but I tell you what, that book, as far as going through it in a book that you can read 2 or 3 times over and get something completely different out of it every time you read it, that's one thing that I would say. Look, it's an investment in time, that's for sure. You're not going to read it in a day, but that's a book that I really found after having a good read through that a few times over. Is there's a lot of good nuggets of gold in that one, and for me personally, I really like that book as something that can overarchingly position people from both investment types, managing your cash flow, managing your mindset, and everything that comes with just trying to live the best and most enjoyable life you can.
Yeah, it's beautiful, mate, and it is a cracker. It is the Bible of money, really. It encapsulates a lot in it. And something that I think you've just sparked a thought in my head as we speak on this, Paul, but I've noticed that one of the common threads amongst successful investors again are those that actually do take the time to read some of those tomes, because, and I say it in my own book, the first test of your persistence and resilience will be whether you get to the back page of this book. And if you don't, if you get through a few pages and flick it into the pile with a collection of others sitting on the library floor, that'll be a direct expression of how well you're likely to do when you start investing in property or anything else.
Awesome analogy.
Yeah, it is, because if you've got that sort of diligence to take it through to the end, then you've got the right sort of mindset that's going to be appropriate. Because it's a long, slow, and very boring process, as you've just mentioned. It's like watching grass grow successful property investment. But that's exactly what it should be, because if you're having to actively manage the damn thing, then that's taking time away from spending with friends, family, and the stuff that you actually enjoy doing.
Agreed, mate. Absolutely.
No, that's awesome. Now, this one's a little bit left field, but it's a question that a lot of our investors continually ask us. And while it's not the reason to invest, it is certainly something that a lot of Aussies worry about. And that revolves around tax, mate. So what's the top legal thing that you've done to minimise the tax that you pay?
Yeah, look, it's a very good question. I think it's always something that people probably don't consider enough until it's too late. But one thing I always would suggest that as part of tax, and another person I've had as part of my investment journey the whole way is my property-focused accountant, someone who has far more property and far more focus and far more success in property values than I probably will ever have. But he's also 20 years further in the game than me. But for me, been a very much a key person that before every purchase investment decision, whether it's a development, a buy and hold, an SMSF purchase, a trust, a commercial purchase, etc., is really understanding the pros and cons of it all. But for me, it's knowing that every single property should fit a certain position on your tax bill. And that being said, I don't buy every property in a trust. I don't buy every property in my name. I don't buy every property in my wife's name or a unit trust or different structures. It always comes down to why we're buying this and what are the tax implications if we buy it under certain structures, as well as what's the exit plan for this particular property. And that's the part, is entering into it. It doesn't need to take too long to figure those things out. It literally can take 10, 15, 20-minute phone call most of the time. But that is the question you need to ask yourself, or at least ask your accountant and or potentially your lawyer and broker at that time, to be able to get that clear understanding of what it's going to mean on all those different answers.
Brilliant answer, mate. That's the best response to that question I've heard, Paul. And it's something that I haven't even thought about it, but it's something that I've always done with my accountant. My accountant's almost my shadow when it comes to this process, because it is about thinking about the longer term. It's not about what you're doing today. It's how does this need to perform for me, and more importantly, what structure is going to assist me in relation to when I get out of that property at some point down the track.
Agreed.
So that beautifully said, mate. Beautifully said. Mate, coming back to the investment subject, what's been both the worst and the best piece of investment advice that you've received to date?
Mate, probably if I start on the worst, I would probably look at it to say the vast majority of, not necessarily single dimension and one person that said one thing to me over and over, but probably the biggest mistake, which ends up leading into people actually taking action on this advice, is people typically say, buy where you know. And unfortunately, when they say that, typically people are thinking, well, that's buy within, again, I think I alluded to it earlier, somewhere between 10, 20, 50k radius of where I live, because it's what I'm comfortable with. And unfortunately, I think in this day and age, there is no excuse for not buying in a market that doesn't have fundamentally the right position for growth. Now, that may be in your backyard, but out of 10,000 local government areas that we've got in the country, there's probably a very slim chance that you're going to pick one of those 15 that are actually going to tick the boxes. So that would be, for me, is possibly the worst advice, is just buy something that you can drive past and see on a daily basis. And converse to that, it probably is the best advice that I could give anyone out there looking to buy either their first or their 50th investment, is make sure that you access as much information and data that you can get your hands on, and start macro and end micro. And macro is Australia, and understand what's moving in this country and potentially even beyond. And you spoke about buying the US, mate. I think there's no excuse for anyone not to think more broadly. And you can buy assets basically anywhere, definitely in Australia, but potentially overseas, that are going to give you a far more superior outcome. And most of the time, if you're leveraging experts, you're going to get a far better outcome, because you're not buying in a place that you can drive by after work once a week.
Love it. Love it. Yeah, no, really sage advice there, mate. Mate, coming back to, sort of personal approach, what's a personal habit that you believe contributes most to your investment success?
I truly think it's being repetitious, and I have a method in what I do day in, day out, and that's typically I wake up at a relatively early hour of between 5 and 6. I typically always go from that process to feeding my kids breakfast, and with my wife, I always drop off my daughter at kindy. My wife drops off my son at school, and that's something that we do every single week. And I usually always have the same things that I do. I get to the gym in the middle of the day pretty much every day, and I have my mindset set to the fact that I want to be able to do these things over and over. And by doing that, for me, I also then roll that into my financial life as well as all the other social things. So I assess my finances typically every quarter. I look at my goals and my numbers with my wife, and typically with my accountant and broker, at least every 6 months. And part of that is we reassess where we are, reassess where we're going, and also reassess what we're going to do next. And by having that method, I don't leave anything to chance. And I'm definitely not the most detailed person. If you ask anyone who knows me well, they'll know that I'm not the guy who is dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I'm the guy who's the high-level guy. But I like to know what's happening in between well enough to know that if I need to make a decision, I don't have to rely on a gut instinct to me making a good or bad decision. So I always know where I'm at, both in life, financially, and emotionally. And part of that is, and the biggest part of that is being repetitious in what I do.
Love it, mate. That is awesome, mate. Something we haven't touched on, and again, I don't do much these days, but I know you're an avid surfer, and your book title sums that up beautifully, and the analogies you use throughout the book, relating it back to the whole surfing experience, are very easy to follow, mate. Is surfing one of those repetitious things? Is that your piece of peace where you're sitting on the water, alone in your head, enjoying the waves? Is that something you do pretty regularly?
Yeah, mate, as much as I possibly can, to be honest with you. And unfortunately, with 2 young kids, I don't get to do it enough in the winter time as I'd like to. But I do try to include it into our weekends in the summertime, pretty much every weekend, if not twice or 3 times a weekend. And my boy's been surfing at a very young age, which is pretty cool for me to be able to do with him. And right. Yeah, for me, surfing's, funnily enough, it's a bit more of that. It definitely is, as you said, but it's a bit more of that just pure emotional outlet where I try to think about as little as possible. And half the time for me, the best part about surfing is surfing with my mates, and just literally just getting time to realise why I surfed in the first place, which is a pimple-faced 14-year-old cruising down to the beach and enjoying life and kind of the things that come with life of not having any cares when I'm in the water, or just having a beer after a surf with some buddies. You typically aren't thinking about much other than the good times. And for me, it comes back to the why of property. More of that in my life, the better, as well as for my kids and everything else that goes with it. So that's really, the surfing is the why. And it's not to say that I do that only, but it really does fulfill holistically why I want to be fulfilled financially, is because it allows me to do more of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love it, mate. I know surfing's almost active meditation for me. During my uni days and when I was in South Australia, mate, I've always said you've got to blow up Kangaroo Island before we get any decent surf along the mid-coast. But surfing was always my place of reflection, and I'd always come off the water with a massive smile on my face. And, mate, without digressing, because I know you're under some time pressure, but you've also done a bit of surfing in an old stamping ground of mine up in PNG, mate. Is that right? Yeah.
I was there, only 18 months ago, and a couple of islands off Moresby, in the middle of nowhere. It was a great couple of weeks. Pretty dicey, few hairy moments, but I bet. I actually worked as an architect up in PNG for a couple of years after I finished uni, and I often refer to it as my Indiana Jones days, mate, because it was a pretty interesting. And it's one of the interesting things I took away from that. There was a village. I was working in a tiny little village called Tufi out on the northeast coast of New Guinea, doing a wilderness safari lodge for a crocodile skin farmer in PNG, would you believe? And one of the villagers there turned to me one day and he said, I don't get, and he spoke in pidgin, so I won't bore the listeners with that, but in basic translation was, I don't get you white fellas. You spend 5 days a week busting your guts to do for 2 days a week what I do for 7 days a week. And he was a fisherman, mate. He just used to get up in the morning and he'd go fishing, and it's like, there's actually a fair bit to be said for that. Yeah, bloody hell. So pretty good perspective. But mate, been awesome. Really enjoyed the time. As I say, I think there's a episode 2 coming up so that we can sort of explore some of these common areas in more detail. For those that want to reach out to you, mate, and start having a conversation around how pure property investment can assist them in the buyer's agent space, what's the best way to do that, mate? Yeah, mate, look, they can jump onto our website, purepropertyinvestment.com, and there they can literally just hit contact me, and that can take you straight to my calendar and lock in some time directly with myself in the time that works for anyone who's listening. Alternatively, you can give us a call. We've got just an office number of 1300 98 5428, and anyone can literally just lock in some time to have a chat. As well as that, mate, I think from the book perspective, if they jump onto our website, I've actually got a free book posting as well, opportunity for anyone who wants to jump on our website. You'll see that there's the get the free book tab on there, and if they click on that, mate, I'm going to post out to the first 100 of your listeners a free book. So if they jump onto that, mate, whenever they can, they should be able to grab themselves a copy in the mail of my book, A Surfer's Guide to Property Investing, save themselves $29.95 of whatever it costs via your good bookstores and Amazon, etc.
Yeah, bugger. Because I've spent $16 buying your book.
Oh, mate, you got
So no, I love that, mate. That's very generous of you, mate. I'll definitely probably be promoting that in all of our supporting work on the social platforms as well as in the show notes, mate. It is a really good and it's an easy read. What I love about your book is that you are able to explain some quite complex subjects in a way that's very easy to digest, and that's a skill in itself. So
I appreciate it.
Really is a good read, mate. It's been a really enjoyable chat. Looking forward to more of it. So keen to get you back on board. And what I do on a sort of quarterly basis is do a bit of a around the grounds look at what's happening in property across the country. So given you're playing in that space, would love to get your insights on that if you're open to it, mate.
No, absolutely, mate. Anytime, feel free to reach out. Absolutely happy to jump on the phone and go through those things.
Brilliant, mate. Been an awesome chat. Keep doing some great work. Keep surfing, and we'll talk soon, Paul.
Will do. Thanks, Bushy. Thanks for your time, mate.
Cheers, mate. Well, freedom fighters, how good was that? To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello hello@khgroup.com.au. That's hello@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/get invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening. And as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die tomorrow.